Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 9, or if you're counting from the beginning, Episode 21. Gosh, it's gone by so fast. We have so many episodes out now. Just can't wait for the day when we get into the hundreds. So this is going to be exciting. But yeah, before we get started, please do remember to subscribe, tap the bell to be notified if you're watching on YouTube. Definitely leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if that's where you listen. That always helps us to get more reach. And also a quick reminder, as usual, that this podcast is made possible and sponsored by NextWave Partners. NextWave Partners is passionate about working with people and organizations to drive the transition towards a sustainable and innovative future. NextWave Partners creates opportunities and shapes markets globally by providing elite human capital solutions, so they can help you with your recruiting needs as well as talent retention. There's a lot of exciting things that NextWave is doing. So if you're looking to grow your team or take your career to the next step, please do reach out to NextWave directly. You can do so by emailing them at info@next-wavepartners.com, or you can go to their website and find a consultant who will be able to basically help you. You can reach out to them directly through LinkedIn, and the website is next-wavepartners.com. And so with that, let's get into today's episode. Today's episode was a really great conversation with Holly Lichtenfeld. She is the Chief Growth and Strategic Alliances Officer at SustainaBase. And generally speaking, SustainaBase is what it is an ESG SaaS platform that helps companies to track, record, set, and hit their ESG targets as well as their sustainable development goals. Obviously, this is a very hot topic right now. A lot of people are discussing this, so I figured it'd be a great conversation to have at this moment in time. So really was able to kind of get some clarity on what exactly they do, what are the challenges, what types of companies should be tracking their ESG. So it was a really interesting conversation. As usual, went in many directions, but we covered a lot of ground. So with that, I hope you enjoy the show as much as I did recording it. It was a really great conversation, and let's get into it. All right, welcome to the show, Holly. Thank you so much for coming on today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. I'm glad you're happy to be here. We're really excited to have you. So could you, I guess, for everybody listening, just give us a quick background on yourself, kind of your story, and how you ended up at SustainaBase?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start by describing SustainaBase. So SustainaBase is a SaaS software company, and we have a tool that enables organizations, whether they're corporations or municipalities, to track their carbon emissions, waste, water, packaging, anything they need to track related to ESG, environmental, social, and governance data components. And then we run the calculations for them in the system so that they look at all that converted to carbon emissions as they need to. So my background is I have worked in sustainability and renewable energy over the years, primarily at startups. Early in my career, I worked at a really fun startup in the early 2000s in the renewable space. And what was cool about that is we did the first installation at Googleplex at the time. And sort of similar to the work that I do now, what was cool about that is we use that as a thought leadership move to educate other companies on, if Google's doing this, to follow that. And just like what's going on in the space around measuring your carbon and all of that, seeing so many companies doing it and making it easier for them is a great way to get other people involved. And then I think you also asked how I got to SustainaBase. So I was serving on a sustainability advisory board for a city, and I met Matt Zirkelbach, who's one of the founders of SustainaBase. And we were working on a team for the city together. It's a client of SustainaBase's. And we realized we had very much values in common, and I was super excited about what they were doing. And so that was really my gateway to started working with the company.
Awesome, very good. Yeah, I think it's interesting how tight the space is, especially a lot of people coming from renewables, like you had mentioned, over into this ESG space. I think that there's also a lot of ambiguity around exactly what ESG is. So maybe you could help us to understand that a little bit more depth. Could you explain what ES and G stand for, kind of what they each mean, and just kind of break that down in a little bit more depth?
Absolutely. So it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And these are essentially the three main pillars that a lot of investors and companies are looking to define better. And we'll talk about this, I'm sure, as we go and come up with ways to make it more consistent, what's being reported. But in the E pillar are environmental things like your carbon emissions footprint. Like I'd said, we're starting to track things more and more companies like waste and important resources like water fall under that. And then translating that all to understanding your carbon emissions. And then under the social one, a lot of the clients we work with call that their people area. So that's where you're looking at things like how diverse is your workforce? Are you doing a good job of diversifying your board if you're a public company or even a private company? And are you training your existing staff on those topics? And then the G, which is the governance, kind of pulls it all together is, do you have good policies in place? Are you giving many people throughout your organization access to the information? So one of the things our system does is it hits on the G in governance, because a lot of those E and S components are scattered throughout organizations. And when you put it together in one system, then you can give more people in the enterprise access to it. And you're kind of checking a box on governance in that you can have your senior leaders, your board, and other people now have data visualizations and information to help them understand that better.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious. Maybe I'm assuming you work with a lot of different types of clients, but what about with smaller companies? You've obviously worked in a number of startups yourself, so I'm just curious. When things are young and they're just like getting things going, they may not prioritize putting these things on the list, getting policies in place, right? The word policy might scare even some of the employees, right? So could you talk about kind of maybe the struggles that some companies have, or maybe the benefit of still implementing this, even if you are a small company?
Yeah, I think that the good news is if you're a small company, then you have a smaller footprint, right? So it's a little easier to get your hands around it. A lot of the approach we take with, we work with all size companies. So we have smaller companies all the way up to multi-billion companies. So we really do work across the board. So with the smaller companies, we really look at what their needs are, because some small companies are selling into big companies like Walmart. And Walmart has a program called Project Gigaton. And if those small companies participate in it, there are some advantages and recognition for them. So if they start to do their building blocks early and they get, what's appropriate for them, because, and that's also a lot of the way we look at it, is we want to help you so that you can focus on your work, but still do these good things at the same time. But I think those small businesses have ways that they can just start on the path without, going overboard. And then as they grow, they'll be able to amp it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's almost at this point, given kind of the movement, and maybe you could talk about this for larger companies. It sounds like, especially with the example that you gave of Walmart, that it can be actually a business advantage to these companies to implement these things, so they can get the stamp of approval from these from the frameworks. Which maybe why don't we do that? Why don't we talk about those frameworks next? Could you mention some of those companies and how that's being rolled out? I'm very curious about how this is working, given that, especially in the US, there's not really regulations per se on these things. So could you talk about that as well?
Yes. So the regulatory framework is a little bit of a wild west. We have a lot of companies that are being asked to report to a lot of frameworks, fill out different things for their customers. So there are a lot of different companies that are asking their supply chain to report into them. So the approach we take is we collect all the data to what's called the greenhouse gas protocol. It's like the good accounting practices for carbon and all these other components, so that whatever reporting or regulatory framework you have to report into, that you followed by us following it and knowing the guidelines, you've built it in an appropriate way. And then some of the regulatory frameworks are things like CDP, is a very widely known one. There's SASB, SASB. That one is very widely used as well. They have sector different reporting you have to submit depending on what sector you're in. Then there's TCFD, which is financial leaning a little bit more and more into climate risk, as well as the other components. There's really, I think it's called an alphabet, an alphabet soup. And so
Hmm.
there's a lot out there. So that's why, we see this need and we come in and help to, because there's a front end where there's data that you have to collect. You don't even know what data to collect and then how to apply the calculations. And then there's the other side, which is various companies are being asked to do all these different kinds of reporting.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a really messy process, especially for a small team that has limited resources, right? So my guess is, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this process of when you go into a company with SustainaBase, how you help them implement it. So I'm assuming it takes a lot of time off of their plates, and you're helping to get them automated. So could you maybe talk us through that procedure?
Yeah, it's very much understanding their needs, where they're sitting today and where they might go in the future. So right now, for all these different companies, it's not like one size fits all. So they may have different data they need to collect. It may depend on what industry you're in. So we really help them to evaluate that so that the idea is that you're collecting what's most meaningful to you. And we do work, there's the reporting side of it, which we've been talking about. But then we also work with a lot of companies, thankfully, because I'm very passionate about this, that want real data to inform real action. So that's what we help with is we do a process to really understand their individual business and make sure that we're helping them to focus on not collecting everything, at least at the beginning. Over time, they may add more things, but it's, start in the right way, collect real data, have that start informing what you're doing and giving you a story to share with your stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of the companies that I've had on here in this climate tech space, some of it just comes down to making, identifying what's actually going on, such as, energy usage, right, in buildings, right? Identifying what's happening so that you can actually make an adjustment. So that's helpful. What are some of the biggest benefits? I'm assuming there's quite a number of benefits, but maybe if you could go into some detail about some of the short and long-term benefits of implementing and tracking these things. I think a lot of people overlook or maybe are not fully aware of what the benefits are, because a lot of times they assume that if there's going to be regulatory repercussions in the future, that it's actually just a pain in the butt to do this, and there's no benefit. So could you talk about those benefits?
Yes. I think there are many. So let's see if we can hit all of them. So the first one is, so I have a customer we work with, and they're a privately owned company. They are not tied to any regulation right now, but they feel it's part of their DNA and that their customers will appreciate it. But I think even on top of that, they're seeing money savings. So they are upgrading their air conditioning. They have, 30 plus locations. They're upgrading their HVAC systems. They're switching their fleet from diesel to compressed natural gas to renewable natural gas and ultimately to electric. They're installing solar in some of their locations. They're doing energy efficiency, and they look at all of those as good business now, money saving. And they're one of our clients, which we help to come up with an internal cost of carbon, internal price for carbon. And so they're seeing that down the line, there may be regulation that makes them account for that, but now they want to incorporate that in their decision making. So there is a benefit if you understand that process, that you incorporate it into your spending. And when you're evaluating how much something is going to cost, especially something that's going to last for many years, you look at it from that perspective. And then there's, of course, the value of your customers and your investors perceiving what you're doing as positive, because there's all this data that shows that companies that are sustainable do perform better. And so being able to go out there and show that you're even doing something like making carbon neutral goals that are meaningful, and you're actually making action based on real data to reduce your emissions and then offsetting what's left, that can be perceived very positively by your end customers and by your investors.
Okay, got it. Any other, other big benefits maybe on the social side of things that you've typically seen?
Yeah, I think again, that's a lot of perception is a positive one, as well as again, all the data that shows that businesses do better that diversify their perspectives and their boards and their workforce. And that's why there's a lot of investors that are pushing for that because they feel like in the end it actually helps the business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that there tends to be, especially with the highly politicized world that we have in the US, that there tends to be just maybe disregard for these things and don't really look at the in-depth long-term benefits. I know as a recruiter seeing companies, I mean, it's become very apparent that many people won't even consider being a applying to jobs if the company doesn't have a diverse board, right? Because they don't want to be part of it, right? Even though they might be trying to make that change, they have to like make up for it, right? So I think that these things are typically underlooked and maybe under anticipated what's happening. One thing I'm curious about is, do you have an understanding of kind of what the regulatory landscape looks like for these things? I know obviously in other parts of the world, there's a lot of this regulation that exists to make sure companies track these things. But what do you see as the future for the regulatory kind of landscape in the US? What are some of the big items that might come up first? I'm just very curious to hear so businesses can kind of think about that and maybe get the gears turning.
Absolutely. So you're right. The EU is further along on this, but there's a lot of buzz now about the SEC looking at potentially regulating climate is the one that comes up, and some of the diversity, and they were taking comments, and so basically there's nothing that's come out the other side yet, but there's a lot of anticipation that that will come down the pike. Obviously, that will be for public companies. Um, and then on the other aspect of the regulatory world, so I would say the two things that are coming down are probably things around, I'm not an expert in this, so I'm just, I happen
Yeah.
to read a lot about it because we need to know where the data needs are going, but we're pretty well aligned with what we're hearing. So again, just saying I'm not an expert in this, but what we're seeing is the SEC sounds like they're going to be coming out with something, and we know people are anxiously, awaiting to see where that will be. There also some talk about looking at the definition of materiality, which is very important for the investment world. And then there's also talk of trying to streamline the regulatory frameworks we talked about earlier, but at least from what I'm seeing, it's feels like that's going to take a while.
Mm.
I think it's
Yeah,
going to be
I
messy.
think I think nothing in government moves very quickly, unfortunately. But we actually talked about that in the past episode here about potentially speeding things up. But obviously, government is made in a way that's not supposed to per se be quick. So that's interesting. I did hear about that with the SEC. That's interesting. I think that could be um, it could just really be a pretty big could create a lot of waves in the market. So that's helpful to know. What do you feel? I guess the necessity, because if we think about this, and obviously there's benefits, it sounds like there's a lot of cost savings, and a lot of people talk about the circular economy and how we think about, instead of from cradle to grave, it's cradle to cradle. Have there been, to your knowledge, any studies done that kind of maybe estimate, because I know it's got to be very difficult to do, estimate if companies implemented these practices, how much more production there could be and how much savings there could be just in general, and where workforce is being put right now, where they could be. Do you know of anything that exists like that people could look into?
I don't know of anything off that's super interesting though. I don't know of anything that's run that calculation. Certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I'm even thinking of, who might take something like that on, but I think there are lots of estimations out there, more so about like if we do this. So again, using the Walmart program, they have this goal of removing a gigaton
Hmm.
of emissions, but it's less of what you're talking about, where it's like, where could the productivity go instead and all of that. So yeah, I don't have an answer
Yeah,
to
it's a tough one. I think that even some of the biggest consultancy firms probably wouldn't quite have the data to do that. That'll be interesting. That maybe brings us to another topic. You mentioned earlier, we talked about a little bit in that last answer, you had talked about investors, right? What about for larger companies or for companies that are looking to grow really quickly and scale? Are there going to be negative impacts to not implementing these things, especially as investment funds really start to implement these due diligence practices to make sure that the companies are doing such? Can you talk a little bit about maybe the negative consequences of not doing this?
And you're saying for certain size companies, you're asking that?
Yeah, for companies that are seeking outside investment from private equity or from institutional investors to, like, a startup that's looking to raise funds, those types of companies that's an important aspect for them. Or maybe even if it's localized, I'm not sure how small this gets, but local banks potentially issuing loans as well.
Right. And I have to say again, because we work less so with, startups, I'm not really sure what they're seeing. To me, though, based on if you take what's going on, like sort of as a microcosm, or a macrocosm, I guess, of like everything that's going on with larger companies, and assuming that's trickling down,
Hmm.
you would think that, so when companies go to acquire startups, they might really like to see one that is already moving along this way versus, let's say, acquiring a startup that didn't think about sustainability at all and built like this incredibly carbon intensive, you know what I mean? Like, let's say
Yeah.
you're a startup in some sort of tech or manufacturing, and like you happen to pick your supply chain with none of this in mind. And so all of a sudden I'm going to be acquiring, it's almost like, actually, now that we're talking about it, I'm thinking about the cybersecurity world. So there's a whole thing now where when a company acquires a small company, they run them through cybersecurity hoops because they don't want to take in anything that's going to bring a big cybersecurity risk with it. And now that you're asking the question, I could see that being similar, that all these companies we're working with are trying to minimize their carbon footprint and the carbon footprint in their supply chain. And all of a sudden you're going to go and acquire someone who somehow has something. So I think some of that is, from an acquisition perspective, might
Hmm.
be something to consider, as well as how investors might perceive investing in you. I could definitely see it, that startups being a mirror of what's going on with the larger companies in that way.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great. We've never really talked about cybersecurity on this show at all, but I think that is a great analogy. I know very little bit about it, but that's a pretty recent thing. We've seen so many issues with cybersecurity in our recent past. I think it's a little bit. We can all keep it close to our heart. So that's interesting. Um, what have been some of the big objections that companies have if you're in a sales meeting and trying to get them to get on board with this process? What have been some of the objections to implementing and tracking these things?
I think it's less, it's not a space. So it's really interesting. So I shared my early work in renewable energy. And one of the big things I worked on back then was barriers to entry, because it was a huge problem in the early-ish 2000, because it was so
Hmm.
much more expensive than it is now. I feel like where we are in time with the ESG work is, there are companies that are either on board and need it now, or there are ones that don't see it yet, either because they don't need it for some reason, or they're just, they're not right there. So it seems like the world has tilted, and kind of I've been waiting and very happy this point is here. But like, if you see BlackRock making the announcement, all of
Hmm.
these other big companies are pushing everything. So that is really reducing the objection part, I think, because, I think it depends on how big you go with it and what is the right fit for the particular company. But I feel like it's starting to be pretty pervasive that some flavor of this is important to just about every organization, which excites me because that means we're all sort of
Hmm.
moving in the right direction.
Yeah, it takes it's very interesting to look at it from the adoption curve side of things, right? Obviously, solar is now at a point where it's probably it doesn't make any sense not to do solar, right? And the same thing, I think it looks like we're getting close to that with ESG, and there's lots of types of people, and I think that this is something I struggle with remembering. Those people think differently than I do, and there's maybe the more analytical people who are like, I need to see the data before I'm going to implement this into my company. So I think that as we go down there, that'll be interesting to see it just kind of take hold. Um, what if some of the what have some of the biggest surprises been along the way? Things that you didn't expect that along this journey that are just really exciting or just very interesting to consider?
I would say it's what we just talked about. So I've sort of been waiting for that moment when the lever clicks and because, I've been looking at the data on climate change for a while, actually. I've gone out, I do unrelated to work, although it's related, is I do talks at universities and things like that, educating people about climate change. And, it's been here for a while, and I've always worked on the business side of that, trying to get businesses to move along. And so I was waiting for that inflection point. So I guess it's a pleasant surprise. You kind of feel like maybe it won't come. So I feel like we're at a moment in time that there's a lot more pointing in this direction and getting a lot more like legitimate momentum, like it's feeling like it's real. And that, the data shows that as more people live through climate impacts, and all those people are business people, right? They're not just consumers, they're not
Hmm.
just individuals, they also work at companies and run companies. So we're getting more of and I think that that's a very pleasant surprise that, yay, we're at a moment. And I don't know if you're seeing that in the work that you do with the increase in jobs. I mean, I see on my LinkedIn the increase in comments, and the fact that there are job openings in this sector is just exploding.
Yeah, it is definitely growing very quickly. I always hesitate to use my LinkedIn as an example because we always create mini echo chambers, right?
Yes, that's true.
Within what we're looking for, but no, I think that's good. That's a good to hear that it is widely being accepted. I think that I come from a very rural area of the world in northern Wisconsin, and I'm always curious to understand how these big trends will be adopted or whether or not they will be adopted. I know that there's a large portion of people in northern Wisconsin still who don't necessarily think renewable energy is viable, right? Because they're stuck on data from 20 years ago, right? So I'm curious to see how that will be rolled out. What are maybe there's a number of things we could talk about. I'm just curious. We didn't talk about this much. Could you explain a little bit about the different scopes, the 1, 2, and 3 scopes? I believe they called the emission scopes, and
Yeah.
kind of how that affects companies. How can they look at it, especially for larger organizations, given that their suppliers may not report these things? What does that look like? And could you explain all those things to us?
Sure. There are 3 scopes, and this is kind of connected to what I talked about before, which is the greenhouse gas protocol, is a lot of the way that it, looks at how you account for these. So we'll make our way through the scopes. So scope 1 is direct emissions. So those are things that companies have direct control over, and included in that are like owned and operated company facilities and company vehicles. So your own fleet, whether it's car fleet or truck fleet. Then there's scope 2, which is considered indirect. Among scope 2 and scope 3 are both indirect, but they're different types of indirect. So scope 2 is indirect, and that is your purchased electricity. So the stuff that comes from the utility. And then scope 3 is a whole range of indirect things. So that can be things like your employee commute and your employee business travel. It can be things like in your supply chain that you don't have control over. So if you use a contract manufacturer, that would be in that. It could be third-party transportation and distribution. It can be even things like the use of sold items. And so it's all of these things that by nature of you doing your business, you impact, but that you don't have direct. So for example, you don't really have direct control over what recycling options a consumer has near their home, but you are creating the material, and you can make it more or less easy for, let's say, a majority of people in the country to be able to do something with it. So those are the different scopes. And what we're seeing is a big trend. There was a time where you measured your scope 1 and scope 2 and you're done. But now the data is, especially a lot of companies, and if you think of how much we've outsourced manufacturing, that like 90% of a company's emissions live in their supply chain, which is their scope 3. So we're working with a lot of companies that are having us go into their supply chain and collect data on their product emissions, their supplier emissions, And we're seeing a trend where there's something I wrote an article on this called the club, the carrot, and the conversation. So with your supply chain, we're seeing some companies put a carrot out there. We would like you to account for, report, and reduce your emissions. That's sort of the carrot. Maybe we'll do some nice things for you. We'll put more of your product on the shelf, or we'll give you some favorable treatment. Then there's the conversation, which is we analyze, let's say, transportation distribution for a company, and they realize a particular company makes up a lot of their emissions. They can go engage that company in conversation and make sure that that company knows it's important to the customer that they head towards zero emissions in a certain amount of time. So those are things that are happening. And the last thing is the club, where we're actually seeing some supply chain, some folks over their supply chain saying you need to reduce emissions by this amount, otherwise there's going to be penalty. We're not seeing a ton of that yet, but there's little bits of that. So all of a sudden, scope 3 is more important than it ever was before. But you can start with scope 1 and scope 2 and then get in, you don't have to do everything at the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think because it's such an integrated, right? You think about, I remember, in high school they talked about nobody knows how to make a pencil, right? Because there's so many aspects that go into it, right? Everything is intertwined very, very in depth, right? So the more companies do implement these things, we'll have more data to be able to then go out. Maybe one other item. I'm not sure if this is a big point or not, but I typically like to ask, what can be done with all the data that's going to be collected? Are there like really big kind of goals that everybody's looking towards and saying, hey, once we get this or that, we know we can start to achieve these things or fix these problems? Are there any items like that are going into consideration?
I'm not sure I understand exactly. You mean like so I guess maybe this will answer your question. So, we go in and provide a footprint for someone. Let's say they thought their electricity was going to be their biggest issue, but it turns out actually they're refrigerants, because when you apply the correct calculation, and actually, if anyone follows the drawdown project, just with that example, that's like one of the top sources of emissions. So all of a sudden the company goes, oh my, I was about to go do electricity stuff, but you know what? We're going to start working on refrigerants first, or we're going to work on both. So sometimes there can be surprises and help them to really make moves that would be more impactful.
Yeah, I guess maybe I think that just that answer gives us the answer anyways, because as we collect more data, I think that there's so many things we probably don't know, right? We don't know what we don't know yet. And we can look at the macro then on all of these companies and see what are some of the big issues that need to be solved. That's something I'm excited for. I just know that data is a tough one, given, you have to, people need to share it. You want to keep privacy, et cetera, and you need to work on it. But that's interesting. A couple other things here. So what have been, for SustainaBase, as you've been with them, what have been the biggest challenges so far for the company just growing in general?
One of the interesting things, and I'm sure that every aspect of clean tech has this, is it's very ever changing and fast moving. So it's a challenge I love. As you can tell, I love talking to people and hearing what they're dealing with. But that's going to be and continue to be a challenge, is the fact that aspects of this, and we have to stay on top of what's changing, and ensuring that we're not only doing what's needed today, but we're very much looking at like what's coming next. So I think that's, new industry, new tech, that's always part of it. It makes it exciting.
Yeah, it probably has to be a little bit complicated too, given that there is no one standard to use. You have to constantly be understanding kind of what's changing in that space. That's got to be a big challenge, especially with software.
The good news is at least the greenhouse gas protocol is pretty established. So it's more like the stuff swirling around what you pull out of it in a way. So hopefully, I think that's got enough momentum that will stay one of the main building blocks. So that's something everyone can feel good about, though, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And what are some, I guess, what types of companies should be looking at implementing, a software like this? Are there any companies that you'd say it's really important for these? Because I'm assuming the answer is kind of all of them, but um, even if you think about small businesses in local, like rural areas, can you kind of explain where the most important aspects should be, or which businesses should really be looking at it that can probably really, really heavily benefit from these things?
Yes, so we have a lot of exciting types of companies that we work with that all have great opportunities to okay. So first of all, I think if it's in your DNA and you want to be doing this right, then it's great to do it in the DNA of the brand. There's a lot of companies that are in a position where that is important to them, but they also have, so if you supply to Walmart or AT&T, there's a whole long list of companies that care and ask their supply chain to report out. So it's very important for those companies. And what comes with that is we work with technology companies because a lot of those have data centers and there's certain calculations that need to be done to accommodate for that. We have manufacturing companies, whether they own their own or have contract manufacturers, because again, everyone's being asked to not just be them, but down the pike. So it's technology, it's retail locations as well. Retailers fall into that, professional services. So they have a lot of business travel. So it depends on what industry you're in. You have different things you have to measure. And then I think to your rural company example, so it's interesting you say that. I was just talking to a company that is a manufacturer in a rural area, it's a family-owned business. They use a lot of electricity though in the manufacturing process, but they also have a lot of constraints because there's not a lot of like good alternatives there. There's not like waste to energy, let's say, and their waste option. So I was talking to them about like more creative things. So finding ways to maybe if there's any waste that they can use from someone else or that they can, recycle elsewhere. So I think small rural companies have really interesting opportunities. I was actually speaking to another one that is a flower grower and they have retaining ponds and they also have local relationships to they do biofuel on their premises with stuff that they get from local companies. So if you start thinking about it, you can be super creative. And then also you have like this great story to tell. And I know that at those two companies, the one that's really enacting stuff, their employees, it's the earlier thing you were saying. They're this rural company, but they have these awesome, enthused employees because they feel so good about what the company is doing. So it feeds into that attracting talent component.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for especially if a rural company that's small specifically requires people on location, sometimes to get people to move there or to be in those jobs, especially if they're very skilled jobs, it's very difficult. So that can be a big asset to a company. That is interesting you mentioned that. I mean, obviously that's something I've never really thought about, is because of the restraints, having this tool could really help them to identify where they could be creative or help them to come up with creative processes and maybe look at potential partnerships locally, which I think would be obviously a benefit to many, right? So, and it helps to advance this kind of circular recycling economy of sorts. So, very interesting. Well, I think we've gone through quite kind of the main things. I guess, are there any other, I guess, what is your thoughts in the future of the space, right? For ESG SaaS platforms in general, where do you see it in 10 years? Kind of what should we look forward to? What are you looking forward to?
Well, one of the things I love about working in this space, which I think will be the thing we look forward to, is it gets more people who need to be in the enterprise engaged in this and knowing that this is important now to the company, because it's touching different elements where the data lives frequently in the company, and we need to work with different groups that you may not traditionally think would be involved in sustainability. Sustainability used to be super siloed. It still is, but it's changing. And so I think over the next 5 to 10 years, what will happen and what this will help to do is to get more people exposed to it. And that to me is so important in terms of education. And it will allow more people, because I think I hear people all the time wanting to switch careers into this space. So if people can be in their area of expertise, but touching this, I think that's going to be a really great thing for the for the health of the planet, and also for all of us who, the people who want to get purpose and feel connected to maybe helping to do things. So I think it can be a real force for good, both in terms of helping the companies with all the benefits we talked about earlier, but also helping to give people more satisfaction and exposure to it in their jobs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that I don't know if anybody listening is a fan of Simon Sinek, but I'm quite a fan of him and his talk about, especially I think he geared it at millennials, his very famous talk about climbing the mountain and just wanting to get to the top right away. But generally speaking, the younger generation wants something to be aiming towards, right? They want to be part of something bigger. And if you're just at, a local coffee shop, you might get, a little bit annoyed and want to do something greater and something better. But if there's a specific mission behind it, it can actually really be fulfilling while you're, working your job and going through university, for example. Um, awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been very interesting. I very appreciative of you explaining these things. It's a very tough topic, I think, for a lot of people. So yeah, any final thoughts you wanted to leave us with?
No, I guess I would say that, this area needs all of the passionate and bright and enthused people working in it. And so, anything that you hear that gets you excited, go in that direction and, reach out to people. I'm always happy to talk to people who want to learn more about this, whether it's, from any angle, if they're interested in getting into it. So I just say, let's help companies and let's get more people working in this. So, and thanks for having me here to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, where can people reach out to you or to SustainaBase?
So our URL is SustainaBase.com. So you can find us there. There's a couple of contact forms. Feel free to respond on there. And you can even say that you heard me here if you wanted to connect directly. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So you should find me as Holly Lichtenfeld. Please reach out. And those are probably the best ways.
All right, very good. I sure hope a lot of people reach out. Maybe they're looking for a career change, and hopefully many good things come out of this. So thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining on today's episode. I really hope you found value out of this conversation with Holly. I really enjoyed speaking with her and kind of learning about this space. It's just super fascinating, kind of the different moving parts that are in this industry, especially with there being so many things to encompass when you're looking at ESG in general. So please, share your thoughts, what you thought about the podcast, any questions that you wanted to follow up with, or just kind of general thoughts in the space in general. You can, reach out to me on Twitter at Silas Maynor, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, always posting there, of course. Share your comments in the post. And you can also, of course, join the Slack channel if you're interested in becoming more of a part of the climate tech and clean tech community. It's a great way to become a member of other people who are like-minded, learning, and other professionals who are somewhat deep into their career. Our goal is to help foster connections there and help people to become more educated and just kind of advance their knowledge and their careers in those spaces. Also, feel free to please do share this with somebody who might find value out of this episode. I think there's a lot of our friends typically, they might be skeptical of some of these things that are kind of more innovative. A lot of people have kind of a low tolerance for risk. So maybe share this episode with somebody who might find value in it, might kind of start to see the sense of these things and why we do them. Also consider subscribing to the newsletter, which always comes out on the 27th of the month. This month, with the holidays coming around the corner, we will be talking about sustainable shopping. So a couple different practices that you can implement there, and just kind of some of those different, maybe on a more individual level, ways that we can be more sustainable. And you can also, of course, support the show by going to the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description, and you can support the show directly there. Another thing too, just last thing here, was a bit unusual. I actually just recently posted a blog about kind of an intro to ESG. So you can feel free to check that out. Link is also in the description if you want to kind of just do a quick read of some of the things going on. And I will continue to write about that over the coming weeks. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us on the episode today, and we'll see you next time.